I held the yellow paper in my hand, reading it a second time to make sure I understood what it said. The notice was printed on official Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association letterhead with a citation number and date stamp in the corner. Violation of Regulation 314. Unauthorized ornamental items on front lawn areas. The words didn't make sense. I walked down our front steps and stood on the stone path I'd carefully installed last summer, looking at the ceramic planter that had apparently broken some neighborhood rule. It was a subtle blue-gray vessel with delicate purple and white flowers that perfectly complemented our home's slate-colored trim. The pot sat just off the walkway on our property, not blocking anything or creating any eyesore. A simple flower pot. That was the great offense. When Emma and I had moved to Oakwood Estates 3 years ago, we'd been drawn to its tidy streets and well-maintained properties. As a landscape architect, I appreciated the obvious care residents took with their yards. The neighborhood had a cohesive aesthetic that appealed to my professional sensibilities: mature trees, consistent lawn heights, and thoughtful plantings. "What's with the face?" Emma called from the doorway, Max padding along at her heels. I held up the notice. "We've been cited by the HOA for the planter." She walked down to join me, taking the paper from my hand. Max circled around us, golden fur catching the afternoon light, before settling at my feet. "This is ridiculous," she said after reading it. "It's just a pot of flowers. Apparently, it's an unauthorized ornamental item." I couldn't keep the sarcasm from my voice. I'd worked hard to make our property blend in with the neighborhood standards. Being significantly younger than most residents, the average age in Oakwood Estates hovered around 65. I'd felt a need to prove we belonged. I'd installed professional landscaping within weeks of moving in: fresh cedar mulch around the bases of trees, perfectly manicured hedges along the property line, and the stone pathway with subtle solar lighting that complemented the traditional colonial architecture of our home. "I wonder if Mrs. Abernathy down the street got cited for her garden gnome collection," Emma mused, handing the notice back to me. "Or the Hendersons with their spinning whirligigs. We'd done everything right." I attended the monthly neighborhood barbecues at the community center, making small talk about lawn care techniques and weather patterns. We ensured Max never barked after 9 o'clock. Our trash bins were always precisely aligned on collection day, exactly 18 inches apart as specified in the welcome packet. "I'm going to check the HOA handbook again," I said, turning back toward the house. "There has to be some mistake." Inside, I pulled the thick binder from our office shelf. Emma had teased me about actually reading it when we first moved in, but my attention to detail had served me well in my profession, and I'd wanted to understand the rules of our new community. I flipped through the pages until I found Section 3, which covered exterior home maintenance and decorations. "Here it is," I said as Emma looked over my shoulder. "Regulation 3.14. No ornamental items are permitted without prior approval from the Architectural Review Committee." "Did you know about the committee?" Emma asked. "Vaguely. I think it was mentioned at one of the barbecues." I closed the binder. I didn't realize we needed permission for a single planter. The frustrating part was how much thought I'd put into that final touch. After completing the major landscape work, the entryway had been missing something. I'd visited 6 different garden centers before finding the perfect planter, one that had the right proportions, color, and texture to complement our home. I'd carefully selected flowers that would provide visual interest through multiple seasons. It was that professional instinct, the desire to create a cohesive and appealing aesthetic, that had led me to add the planter in the first place. And now that same attention to detail had somehow landed me in trouble. "What are you going to do?" Emma asked, running her fingers through Max's fur as he pressed against her leg. I folded the citation paper and tucked it into my pocket. "I guess I need to figure out who's on this committee and talk to them. There has to be a reasonable explanation." "Or you could just move the planter to the backyard," Emma suggested. I looked at her, then back toward the front of the house where the planter sat. The thought of removing it bothered me more than it probably should have. It wasn't just about the pot itself. It was about the principle. The planter wasn't hurting anyone. It enhanced the property. It made our house feel like a home. "No," I decided. "I want to understand why this is a problem. If there's a legitimate reason, fine. But it seems arbitrary." Max followed me as I walked back outside to examine the planter again. I crouched next to it, adjusting a bloom that had tilted to one side. 3 years of carefully following every rule, of making sure we were model residents. And this was what I got, a citation for a flower pot. Something about it didn't sit right. Was it just bureaucracy for its own sake, or was there more to it? Either way, I needed to find out who was behind the citation and why they thought my simple ceramic planter warranted official action. I stood up, brushing dirt from my hands. Whatever the reason, I wasn't going to remove the planter without at least trying to understand the logic behind the rule. I'd start by finding out who served on this architectural review committee. After all, rules should make sense, and if they didn't, perhaps they needed to be challenged. After my third time reading through the HOA handbook, I decided to go straight to the source. If this architectural review committee was responsible for approving or denying ornamental items, I needed to know who made these decisions and on what basis. The handbook listed Carol Winters as the HOA president, with an address on Magnolia Court, the nicest street in Oakwood Estates. I walked up the stone pathway to Carol's Tudor-style house the next morning. Even the stones seemed to gleam, each piece perfectly placed without a speck of moss between them. The lawn looked like it had been cut with surgical instruments rather than a lawnmower. The doorbell chimed a melodic tune I didn't recognize. Moments later, the heavy wooden door swung open to reveal a woman in her 60s with silver hair styled into an immaculate bob. She wore pressed beige slacks and a pale blue blouse adorned with a small brooch. "Yes?" She looked at me with a polite detachment. "Mrs. Winters, I'm Griffin Peterson from Cedar Lane. I received a citation about a planter in my front yard, and I wanted to discuss it with you." Her mouth formed into a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Of course, Mr. Peterson. Won't you come in?" The interior of Carol's house was as meticulous as the exterior. Family photos in matching silver frames lined a console table, and a grandfather clock ticked away in the corner. She led me to a sitting room with furniture that looked too pristine to actually use. "Tea?" she offered. "No, thank you. I won't take much of your time." I pulled out the yellow citation and my phone. "I wanted to discuss this violation notice. I have photos of the planter in question." Carol took the citation, glancing at it briefly before handing it back. "Ah, yes. Regulation 3-14. What seems to be the confusion?" I showed her pictures of the ceramic planter on my phone. "This is the item cited. It's a single planter that complements our home's color scheme. It's not obstructive, oversized, or garish. I'm having trouble understanding why it violates neighborhood standards." Carol clasped her hands in her lap. "Mr. Peterson, you seem like a reasonable man. Surely you understand that rules exist for a reason. Your planter may seem innocuous, but if we allow exceptions, where do we draw the line? Today it's your tasteful pot. Tomorrow it's Mrs. Jenkins with her collection of pink flamingos." "I understand the need for standards," I said, "but this seems—" "Rules are rules, Mr. Peterson." Her tone remained pleasant but firm. "Exceptions lead to chaos. I've been president of this association for 12 years, and I've found that consistency is key to maintaining our property values. Who serves on the Architectural Review Committee? I'd like to submit a formal request for approval." A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, crossed Carol's face before she composed herself. "The committee meets quarterly to review all submissions. The next meeting isn't until the end of March, I'm afraid." "That's 2 months away," I pointed out. "Yes. Well, we can't convene for every little matter. In the meantime, I must ask you to comply with the citation and remove the unauthorized item within 48 hours to avoid further penalties." I wanted to argue further, but something about Carol's demeanor told me it would be futile. This wasn't a conversation. It was a one-way directive dressed up as pleasantry. "I'll remove it today," I said finally. "Excellent." She stood, signaling our meeting was over. "We appreciate your cooperation. Oakwood Estates maintains its charm because residents like you understand the importance of following our established guidelines." As I walked home, I felt frustrated by the encounter. Carol had effectively stonewalled me with bureaucratic language and a facade of reasonableness that masked an immovable position. That evening, I carefully dug up the flowers from the planter and transferred them to our backyard garden. Emma watched from the back door, arms crossed. "This is beyond stupid," she said, as I placed the empty planter in our garage. "I know." I brushed dirt from my hands. "But fighting it means fines we don't need." So we just give in? I looked up at her. For now. But something about this doesn't add up. The next morning, I took Max for his usual walk around the neighborhood. He trotted along happily, untroubled by HOA regulations or neighborhood politics. We turned onto Magnolia Court, and I found myself slowing down as we approached Carol's house. In the daylight, I noticed details I'd missed during my visit. Carol's front yard contained not one, but several decorative elements. Two ceramic garden gnomes tucked beneath a rhododendron bush, and an ornate bird bath on the opposite side of her lawn. All were clearly visible from the street. I stopped walking. Max looked up at me, confused by the sudden halt. You see that, buddy? I murmured to him. Apparently some people can have decorative items and others can't. When we got home, I went straight to my office and pulled out the HOA handbook again. This time, I read Regulation 3-14 with extra attention. No ornamental items are permitted without prior approval from the Architectural Review Committee. The issue wasn't that ornaments were forbidden. They just needed approval. Approval that Carol had somehow denied me while granting it to herself. I flipped to the back of the binder where committee assignments were listed. The Architectural Review Committee had a single name next to it, Carol Winters. I turned to the minutes of past HOA meetings, scanning backward through the years. 8 years ago, there had been a full committee of 3 people. 7 years ago, only Carol remained, with a note. Due to lack of volunteer participation, Mrs. Winters will temporarily assume full committee duties. There was nothing temporary about it now. Carol had created a perfect system. She could approve whatever she wanted for her own property while enforcing the rules strictly on others. Over the next few days, I began paying closer attention during my walks with Max. The pattern was impossible to miss once I started looking. Houses on Magnolia Court, where Carol lived, had various ornamental items, decorative flags, stylized mailboxes, lawn statues. Meanwhile, homes on other streets had received citations for similar items. Thaddeus Merritt, our elderly neighbor who was recovering from knee surgery, had a warning taped to his door about an unapproved bench placed near his front door, a bench he needed to rest on while retrieving his mail. Yet Carol's friend Martha Bryan had a nearly identical bench with no citation in sight. The more I looked, the more examples I found. Imogene Finch, the retired botany professor who lived 3 doors down, showed me 5 citations she'd received for her garden bed that extended 6 inches beyond some arbitrary line. Meanwhile, Carol's flower beds sprawled wherever she pleased. This wasn't just bureaucracy. This was selective enforcement, a system Carol had cultivated to control the neighborhood according to her personal preferences. I sat at my desk that evening, a new spreadsheet open on my computer. Emma leaned over my shoulder, reading the column headers I'd created. Address, violation cited, similar violations on Magnolia Court, response to citation. "What are you doing?" she asked. I entered the first row of data, our address and the planter citation. "Documenting patterns," I replied. "If Carol wants to play by the rules, we should make sure everyone knows exactly what those rules are, and how selectively they're being applied." "And then what?" I looked up at her. "I'm not sure yet, but the first step is understanding exactly what we're dealing with." Max came over and rested his head on my knee, sensing my determination. I scratched behind his ears, thinking about Thaddeus struggling to check his mail and Imogene's careful gardening deemed unacceptable, while Carol's decorations flourished unopposed. "Something needs to change," I said quietly, "and I think I might be the one to change it." The spreadsheet glowed on my laptop screen as I added another row of data. 3 weeks into my documentation project, and patterns had emerged with unmistakable clarity. Carol Winters wasn't just enforcing rules, she was wielding them like a scalpel, cutting away at residents who didn't align with her vision, while granting silent exemptions to those in her favor. I clicked through my photo album, organizing images by address and violation type. This morning's walk with Max had yielded 5 new examples, all meticulously cataloged and time-stamped. "Find anything new?" Emma asked, setting a mug of coffee beside my keyboard. "Tom Wilson got cited for leaving his garage door open yesterday." "The guy who just had back surgery?" I nodded, pulling up the photo I'd taken. "His wife told me they leave it open while she helps him in and out of the car. Carol gave them a written warning. First offense is a warning. Second is a $50 fine." "That's ridiculous," He can barely walk." "Meanwhile," I said, clicking to another folder, "Martha Bryan's garage has been open for 3 straight days while she's having it painted, and not a peep from our HOA president." Emma leaned closer to see the screen. "And Martha lives on Magnolia Court, 2 houses down from Carol." I'd established a routine. Each morning, Max and I would walk through all 8 streets of Oakwood Estates. I kept my camera ready, but discreet, documenting violations both cited and uncited. I'd strike up casual conversations with neighbors, asking innocent questions about yard maintenance that often led to stories about run-ins with the HOA. The stories piled up. Mr. Patel received a citation for wind chimes that were excessively audible. The Jacobsons got warnings about their basketball hoop being visible from the street. Each violation came with the same signature: Carol Winters, HOA President. "You're building quite the case," Emma said, reviewing my spreadsheet. "Look at this column," I pointed to the screen. "Every single property on Cedar Lane and Willow Street has received at least 1 citation in the past year. But Magnolia Court? Only 2 citations total, both to the Hendersons, who coincidentally voted against Carol at the last board election." My background in landscape architecture had trained me to notice patterns: how elements interact, where lines of sight fall, how spaces flow together. The same skills helped me map out Carol's web of influence. Her allies received passes for infractions that would earn immediate citations elsewhere. I stretched and stood up from my desk. "I'm going to check on Imogene Finch. She texted me about getting another citation." Max heard his leash jingling and trotted over, tail wagging in anticipation. Imogene lived 3 streets over, in a modest ranch-style home with the most botanically diverse front yard in the neighborhood. As a retired botany professor, she'd created a miniature ecosystem that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds throughout the summer. When I arrived, she was in her garden, kneeling on a padded mat as she tended to a cluster of emerging spring bulbs. Despite her 85 years and arthritic hands, she worked with the precision of someone half her age. "Griffin, dear," she called when she spotted me. "Right on time." Max stayed politely at the edge of her garden, knowing better than to disturb her careful work. "I got another one," she said, not looking up from her task. She nodded toward an envelope tucked under a stone on her porch. "My phlox apparently extends 8 inches beyond the approved garden boundary." I picked up the citation. "When did this arrive?" "This morning. That's the 3rd this month." She rose slowly, using a gardening tool for leverage. "At this rate, I'll need to take out a loan to pay the fines." I looked at the garden edge in question. The line between grass and garden bed curved naturally, following the contour of the land. "Did you submit a garden plan to the Architectural Review Committee?" I asked, already knowing the answer. 3 times over 5 years. Carol rejects them all." Imogene brushed dirt from her gardening gloves. "She says my design lacks cohesion with community standards. Meanwhile, her yard looks like she rated every display at Home Depot." I took photos of Imogene's garden, the citation, and the supposed boundary violation. "Would you be willing to write down your experiences with the HOA? I'm collecting statements." "Planning a coup?" Her eyes twinkled. "Just gathering information for now." Back home, I added Imogene's case to my spreadsheet. 68 documented violations across Oakwood Estates in the past month. 42 fell on residents who had either opposed Carol in some way or simply weren't in her social circle. The remaining 26 were spread among Carol's known allies, and most of those were first warnings that never progressed to fines. "You've become obsessed," Emma observed that evening as I pored over property maps of the neighborhood. "Not obsessed, thorough. You've spent every evening for 2 weeks on this." She was right. What had started as curiosity had evolved into a mission. But seeing Imogene's arthritic hands struggling to comply with arbitrary rules had hardened my resolve. This wasn't just about a ceramic planter anymore. "I know it seems excessive," I admitted, "but somebody needs to stand up to her." Emma sat beside me. "I'm not criticizing. I'm impressed. Just make sure you're taking breaks." The next day, Max and I varied our route, cutting across the back section of Magnolia Court. Carol's Tudor-style home stood at the corner, its perfectly manicured grounds extending well beyond what seemed possible for the lot size. I slowed my pace, studying her property more carefully. Her backyard stretched toward a wooded area, encompassing a garden with a stone path, a small shed, and a bench positioned beneath a maple tree. A stack of firewood lined the far edge of what appeared to be her property. Something struck me as odd about the layout. Based on the other homes on the street, her backyard seemed disproportionately large. That afternoon, I visited the county assessor's website, pulling up property maps for Oakwood Estates. I clicked through to Carol's address, examining the official boundaries of her lot. The property line ended a full 30 feet before the tree line where she had positioned her bench. According to the official map, Carol's actual backyard was significantly smaller than what she was using. I switched to the county's GIS system, overlaying parcel maps with satellite imagery. There it was, a small, separate lot, just under a quarter acre, that butted up against Carol's property. But this parcel had different shading than the surrounding HOA properties. Curious, I drove to the county recorder's office the next morning. The clerk helped me locate records for the unmarked parcel. "This is interesting," she said, scanning her computer screen. "This lot was part of the original development, but when Oakwood Development Company went bankrupt in 2008, this parcel never made it into the HOA territory. It was supposed to be a small green space or playground. So who owns it now?" She clicked through several screens. "The county does, technically. It's been tax delinquent for years. Nobody's claimed it or paid taxes on it since the bankruptcy. Could someone buy it? Sure. The county would probably be happy to get it back on the tax rolls." She pulled up another screen. "If you're interested, you'd need to submit an offer to the county treasurer. Since it's been delinquent so long, they might accept less than market value just to get it generating property taxes again." I thanked her and left with copies of all the relevant documents. On the drive home, my mind raced with possibilities. Carol had been using land that wasn't hers, land that wasn't even a part of the HOA, as if it was her personal extension. The next day, I took Max for another walk past Carol's house. I slowed down near the property line, pretending to check something on my phone while taking in the details. Carol had placed her gardening shed partially on the unclaimed land. Her firewood stack sat entirely on the separate parcel. The bench under the maple tree, where she often sat during summer evenings, wasn't on her property at all. For years, she'd been enforcing rules down to the inch on other residents while helping herself to land that wasn't hers. Back at my desk, I pulled up the county treasurer's website and found information on purchasing tax-delinquent properties. The process seemed straightforward. Submit an offer, provide proof of funds, complete the paperwork. Emma found me researching real estate attorneys that evening. "What now?" she asked, peering over my shoulder. I explained my discovery about the unclaimed parcel. "So you're thinking of buying it?" She raised an eyebrow. "I'm considering all options." I leaned back in my chair. Carol has built her perfect little kingdom partly on land she doesn't own, land that technically anyone could purchase. And if you owned it? Then Carol would have to follow someone else's rules for a change. Emma studied me for a long moment. "This is about more than just a flower pot now, isn't it?" I thought about Imogene's arthritic hands struggling with garden tools, about Tom Wilson in pain just trying to get from his garage to his house, about all the residents who felt powerless against Carol's arbitrary enforcement. "It was never just about the flower pot," I said quietly. "It's about fairness, about not letting someone abuse their position at others' expense." Emma nodded slowly. "Okay then, let's talk to a real estate attorney." I closed my laptop and scratched Max behind the ears. The dog looked up at me, brown eyes trusting and content. Unlike people, dogs had simple, fair rules. Be kind, be consistent, give clear boundaries. Carol's rulebook shifted depending on who she was dealing with, and that fundamental unfairness had gone unchallenged for too long. I didn't yet know exactly how I'd use this discovery, but for the first time since receiving that yellow citation, I felt like I had found a path forward, a way to bring balance back to Oakwood Estates. "I'll call an attorney tomorrow," I said. The attorney recommended meeting in person. "This kind of property acquisition has some nuances that are better discussed face-to-face," she explained over the phone. 2 days later, I sat across from Miranda Welch, a real estate attorney with 20 years of experience in property law. Her office walls displayed framed photographs of local landmarks alongside her various credentials. "So you're interested in purchasing the unclaimed parcel adjacent to your neighborhood," she said, reviewing the documents I'd brought. "The county assessment value is quite reasonable, especially given property values in that area." What's the process? I asked, leaning forward. Can anyone buy it? Miranda tapped her pen against the property map. In theory, yes. It's tax-delinquent land that the county would be happy to get back on the books. But there are complications. Such as? First, the HOA might claim they have first rights to purchase, though that's contestable since this parcel was never formally incorporated into the association. She flipped through my documents. Second, if the current unauthorized user, this Carol Winters, has been maintaining the property for years, she could potentially claim adverse possession. She's the HOA president, I explained. She's been enforcing regulations down to the inch on everyone else while helping herself to land that isn't hers. Miranda raised an eyebrow. Interesting. How long has she been using the land? I'm not sure exactly, at least since we moved in 3 years ago. She made some notes. Adverse possession in this state requires continuous use for 10 years, so if it's been less than that, she has no legal claim, but we'd need to establish when she started using it. I pulled out my phone and showed her photos of Carol's setup on the unclaimed parcel. Her shed is partially on the land, her firewood pile is entirely on it, and she has a bench under a maple tree that isn't on her property at all. Miranda studied the images carefully. Based on the county documents, this parcel has been sitting untouched since 2008 when the developer went bankrupt. If you're serious about purchasing it, I'd recommend creating an LLC to make the offer. An LLC? She nodded. It adds a layer of privacy. The county records would show the LLC as the owner, not you personally. It keeps your name off public documents, at least initially. I thought about Carol's likely reaction if she discovered I was behind this. That sounds like a good approach. I can help you set that up, Miranda said, and I'd suggest making an offer below market value. The county might accept it just to get the property generating tax revenue again. By the time I left Miranda's office, we had a clear plan. She would help establish an LLC, then prepare and submit an offer to the county treasurer. All I needed to do was decide on a name for the company. That evening, Emma and I sat at our kitchen table brainstorming. It should be something neutral, she said. Nothing that would raise suspicion. I jotted down possibilities. Cedar Properties, Peterson Holdings, Oakwood Acquisitions. No, nothing with Peterson or Oakwood, Emma pointed out. Too obvious. Max wandered over and rested his head on my knee, looking up with his brown eyes. Behind him, through our window, I could see the maple tree on the disputed land. Evergreen Holdings, I said suddenly. Simple, generic, and doesn't connect directly to us. Emma smiled. I like it. The next week passed in a flurry of paperwork. Miranda guided me through establishing Evergreen Holdings LLC with the business address listed as her law office. We submitted an offer to the county treasurer for the parcel, 15% below the assessed value. Don't get your hopes up too quickly, Miranda warned. These government processes can take time, but the county moved faster than expected. The treasurer's office, eager to get delinquent properties back on the tax rolls, accepted our offer within 10 days. 2 weeks later, I signed the final paperwork in Miranda's office. Congratulations, she said, handing me the deed. You are now the owner, or rather, Evergreen Holdings is now the owner, of a quarter-acre lot in Oakwood Estates. I held the document, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and nervousness. What happens now? Now you have property rights. You can ask Ms. Winters to remove her belongings from your land. Miranda passed me a folder. I've drafted some notices you can use. Start with the first one, which is relatively mild, then escalate if necessary. During all this, I maintained my normal routine in the neighborhood. Max and I took our regular walks. I exchanged pleasantries with neighbors, including Carol when I ran into her at the community mailboxes. I even attended the monthly HOA meeting, sitting quietly as Carol discussed new regulations about holiday decorations. No one knew about my purchase. Emma and I agreed to keep it quiet until we were ready to act. 3 weeks after closing on the property, I stood in my home office, holding the first official notice from Evergreen Holdings LLC regarding unauthorized use of private property. The letterhead looked professional, with no trace of my involvement. This is it, I told Emma, who had proofread the document for me. Once I send this, there's no going back. She squeezed my hand. She's had it coming for a long time. The next morning, I mailed the certified letter to Carol Winters. The notice detailed multiple violations. unauthorized plantings, storage of combustible materials, the firewood, and permanent fixtures, the bench and part of her shed, placed without consent. It requested immediate cessation of all activities on the property. 2 days later, I was working from home when the mail carrier arrived at Carol's house with a certified letter. I watched through my office window as she signed for it, tore open the envelope, and read the contents. Even from a distance, I could see her reaction. Her posture stiffened. She read the letter a second time, then a third. Her face flushed red as she stormed back into her house, letter clutched in her hand. Within minutes, I heard her voice through my partially open window. She was on her phone, her tone sharp and demanding. "This must be some kind of mistake," I heard her say. "There's no company called Evergreen Holdings that owns any property in this neighborhood." I smiled to myself and returned to my work. Emma texted me around noon. "Any reaction yet?" "She's making calls," I replied. "Seems upset." Over the next few days, I monitored Carol's behavior. She made several trips to her backyard, taking photos of the area and pacing along what she probably thought was her property line. She spent unusually long periods on her phone, often gesturing animatedly while speaking. A week after the first notice, I sent a second letter from Evergreen Holdings. This one was more detailed, including time-stamped photographs of each violation and specifying the exact boundaries of the property. The letter requested removal of all personal items within 30 days, citing liability concerns. "Do you think she'll comply?" Emma asked as we watched Carol receive this second certified letter. "No," I said. "She thinks she can ignore this like she's ignored HOA rules that don't suit her. She probably believes she can find a loophole, or that whatever company is behind this will eventually give up." I was right. Carol made no attempts to remove anything from the property. Instead, she doubled down, adding a new garden border that extended even further onto my land. The third notice from Evergreen Holdings LLC went out exactly 7 days after the second. This one came with a formal legal warning about trespassing and unauthorized use of private property, along with potential costs for removal services if she failed to comply within the specified time frame. Carol received this letter on a Saturday morning. Through my window, I watched her tear it open on her front porch. This time, instead of immediately rushing inside to make calls, she stood completely still for several minutes, staring at the document. Then she slowly turned and looked up and down the street as if searching for someone watching her. Her eyes passed over my house, not pausing or showing any sign of suspicion. She had no idea that the person behind Evergreen Holdings lived just across the street and down 3 houses. That evening, Emma and I took Max for a walk that deliberately passed by Carol's house. She was in her front yard, clipping her already immaculate hedges with unusual intensity. "Good evening, Carol," I called pleasantly. She looked up, her pruning shears pausing mid-cut. "Griffin. Emma." Her greeting was curt, her smile strained. "Beautiful evening," Emma commented. Carol nodded stiffly. "Yes, lovely." Her eyes drifted to the papers visible on her porch table. The Evergreen Holdings notices spread out alongside what looked like property maps. "Enjoy your weekend," I said as we continued walking. Once we were out of earshot, Emma whispered, "She has no idea." "None at all," I agreed. "She's too convinced of her own importance to imagine someone challenging her like this." We rounded the corner, Max trotting happily ahead of us. "What happens when the 30 days are up?" Emma asked. I thought about the next phase of my plan, the part I hadn't fully shared with Emma yet. "Then Evergreen Holdings will take more definitive action," I said. "Carol has spent years enforcing rules on others while ignoring them herself. In 30 days, she's going to learn what it feels like when someone does the same to her." Max circled back to us, tongue lolling out, completely unaware of the neighborhood drama unfolding around him. I scratched behind his ears, thinking about the countdown that had begun. 30 days until Carol Winters faced the consequences of her actions. The question wasn't whether she would comply with the notices. I knew she wouldn't. The question was how she would react when she discovered who was really behind Evergreen Holdings LLC, and that was something I looked forward to finding out. 31 days passed. Not 30, not 32. Exactly 31 days since Carol received the final notice from Evergreen Holdings LLC. This timing wasn't arbitrary. The legal notices had specified a 30-day compliance period, and I'd given her one extra day as a courtesy she never would have extended to others. At 8:30 a.m., I stood in my kitchen watching the Henderson landscaping trucks pull up along the street. I'd hired them a week ago, providing detailed instructions and property documentation. 4 workers in matching green uniforms climbed out, carrying clipboards and surveying equipment. "You sure about this?" Emma asked, sliding her arm around my waist. "Absolutely," I replied, taking a sip of coffee. I gave her 3 notices and 31 days. She chose to ignore them all. My phone buzzed with a text from Ray Henderson. "We're on site. Property lines confirmed. Ready to proceed?" I texted back, "Yes. Follow the plan exactly as discussed." Through our kitchen window, I watched the crew set up. They placed marker stakes along the precise property line, then began documenting the existing conditions with photographs and measurements. Carol's garden beds, firewood pile, and bench were carefully cataloged before removal. I'd timed this perfectly. According to the Neighborhood Gossip Network, which Emma had quietly tapped into, Carol had a standing Wednesday appointment at her hair salon, followed by lunch with her friend Martha. She wouldn't be home until early afternoon. By 9:15, the crew had started work. A separate truck arrived carrying fence materials, cedar posts and panels for a 6-foot privacy fence. I'd chosen cedar both for its durability and because it matched the aesthetic of the neighborhood. Even while reclaiming my property, I remained conscious of design cohesion. "I'm going to work from the front bedroom today," I told Emma. "Better view of the proceedings." She smiled. "I have meetings until 3, but text me updates." I set up my laptop in our unused front bedroom, positioning my chair to give me a clear sightline to the worksite. Max lay at my feet, occasionally looking up when the sounds of equipment grew louder. The landscaping crew worked efficiently. By 10:30, they had completely removed Carol's garden beds from my property, carefully transplanting her perennials to her actual yard. The firewood stack was relocated piece by piece to just inside her true property line. The bench, a heavy wrought iron piece, required 3 men to move. At 11:45, the fence installation began. Post holes were dug exactly on the property line, each location verified against the survey markers. I sent Emma a photo with the caption, "Halfway there and no sign of Carol." My phone rang at 12:30. Ray Henderson's name appeared on the screen. "How's it looking?" I asked. "On schedule. We've got all posts set, and we're starting panel installation now. Should finish by 4 if the weather holds." "Perfect. Keep me posted if anything changes." I went downstairs to make a sandwich, feeling strangely calm. For weeks, I'd anticipated this moment with a mix of anxiety and satisfaction. Now that it was happening, I felt oddly detached, as if watching someone else's plan unfold. Max followed me to the kitchen, his nails clicking on the hardwood floor. I gave him a small piece of turkey from my sandwich. "What do you think, buddy? Too harsh?" He cocked his head, eyes fixed on the remaining turkey. Back in my observation post, I continued pretending to work while actually monitoring the fence installation. The crew had completed about a third of the panels when a silver Lexus turned onto our street at 1:47 p.m. Carol was home early. I watched her park in her driveway and sit motionless for several seconds, staring at the activity in her backyard. Even from a distance, I could see the moment realization hit her. Her head jerked up, her back stiffened, and she flung her car door open. She marched toward the workers, designer handbag still clutched in one hand, her face reddening with each step. I couldn't hear her words, but her gestures told the story. Arms waving, finger pointing, head shaking in disbelief and outrage. Ray Henderson approached her, clipboard in hand. I knew exactly what he was showing her: the property deed, survey documents, and work authorization from Evergreen Holdings LLC. He pointed to various papers, likely explaining the legal right to install the fence. Carol snatched the papers, flipping through them frantically. She thrust them back at Ray, turned on her heel, and stormed into her house. Less than a minute later, she emerged without her handbag, marching with purpose, directly toward my house. "Here we go," I muttered to Max, who had perked up at the sight of movement outside. I went downstairs and waited in the living room. The doorbell rang, followed immediately by 3 sharp knocks. When I opened the door, Carol stood on my porch, arms crossed, face flushed with anger. Her silver bob, usually perfectly styled, looked slightly disheveled, as if she'd been running her hands through it. "Griffin," she said, her voice tight with restraint, "do you know anything about what's happening at my house right now?" I maintained a neutral expression. "You mean the work crew?" "Yes, I noticed them earlier. They claim to be working for something called Evergreen Holdings." Her eyes narrowed. "They're destroying my garden and building a fence through my yard." "Not through your yard, Carol, along the property line." Her eyes widened slightly. "What do you know about this? Would you like to come in?" I stepped aside, gesturing toward the living room. She hesitated, then entered, standing rigidly in the center of the room. Max approached to greet her, but she ignored him completely. "What do you know about Evergreen Holdings?" she demanded again. I met her gaze steadily. "I am Evergreen Holdings, Carol." She blinked several times, processing my words. "What are you talking about?" "Evergreen Holdings LLC is a company I established for the purpose of purchasing that quarter-acre parcel of land, the land you've been using as an extension of your backyard for years." "That's impossible." Her voice rose. "That land is part of my property." I walked to the side table and picked up a folder. "Actually, it's not. It never was. It was an undeveloped parcel left over from when the original developer went bankrupt in 2008. It was never incorporated into the HOA territory." I handed her copies of the county assessor's documents and the property deed. "You'll notice the parcel number here," I said, pointing to the relevant section. "And here's the deed transferring ownership from the county to Evergreen Holdings LLC, dated 6 weeks ago." Carol stared at the papers, her hands trembling slightly. This is legal?" "Yes, completely. The county was happy to have the property back on the tax rolls." She looked up at me, comprehension dawning on her face. "Those notices, those were from you?" I nodded. "I gave you 3 formal notices over a 30-day period, requesting that you remove your belongings from the property. You chose to ignore them all. In fact, you added new plantings after receiving the second notice." "You can't do this," she said, her voice lower now, dangerous. "I'll sue you." "On what grounds, Carol? Adverse possession? You'd need to have been using the land for 10 years, and you'd need to prove it. The county records show the land has been tax delinquent since 2008, with no registered claims or improvements until my purchase." She dropped the papers on my coffee table. "This is about that stupid planner, isn't it? You're doing all this because of a simple HOA citation?" "No, Carol, this isn't about my planter. This is about fairness and consistency. It's about one set of rules that apply equally to everyone." Through the window behind her, I could see the fence taking shape, panel by panel, cutting off her view of the maple tree she'd claimed for so long. "You've been selectively enforcing HOA regulations for years," I continued, citing elderly residents like Thaddeus and Imogene for minor violations while ignoring similar or worse issues on your own street. "You've used your position to create a 2-tiered neighborhood, one set of standards for you and your friends, another for everyone else." Carol's expression hardened. "You have no idea what it takes to maintain property values in a neighborhood like this. Without strict enforcement." "Strict enforcement should apply to everyone, including you," I cut in. "For years you've been claiming land that isn't yours while nitpicking others about inches of garden bed or decorative planters. That ends today." She picked up her purse, clutching it like a shield. "The HOA board will hear about this. I'm counting on it. In fact, I look forward to discussing this at the quarterly meeting next week, along with some other interesting patterns I've documented." Carol moved toward the door. "This isn't over, Griffin." "Actually, Carol, it is. The fence will be completed today, establishing the legal boundary of my property. What you do with your actual yard is your business, as long as it complies with HOA regulations, the same regulations everyone else has to follow." She left without another word, the door closing with controlled force behind her. I watched through the window as she returned to her house, not once looking back at the fence or the workers. I texted Emma. Carol came over. The reveal went exactly as expected. She responded immediately. "On my way home. Don't want to miss the finale." For the next 2 hours, I monitored the fence installation from my window. Carol remained inside her house, though I occasionally caught glimpses of her watching from various windows. Twice, she came out to take photos of the work and the property line markers, presumably for whatever legal challenge she thought she might mount. Emma arrived home at 3:30, coming directly to the observation room. How much did I miss? She asked. Just Carol's initial confrontation with the workers and then her visit here. The fence is about 80% complete. She stood beside me, watching the final panels being installed. How do you feel? I considered the question. Relieved, mostly, and satisfied that there's finally some balance being restored. Do you think she'll try to fight it? She'll try, I said, but there's nothing she can do legally. I made sure of that before proceeding. By 4:15, the fence was complete, a solid cedar barrier running exactly along the property line, reducing Carol's usable yard by nearly a third. The maple tree she'd placed her bench under now stood firmly on my side of the fence, as did the space where her garden beds and firewood pile had been. The crew cleaned up, loaded their trucks, and departed by 4:45. Ray Henderson stopped by my house on his way out. All finished according to plan, he said, handing me the final paperwork. Property line markers are still in place in case you need them for future reference. I thanked him and paid the remaining balance, adding a generous tip for the crew's efficiency. As evening approached, Emma and I took Max for his usual walk. Our route deliberately passed Carol's house, where the new fence stood as a physical manifestation of boundaries finally enforced. Carol was in her front yard, speaking intently into her phone. She saw us approaching and turned away, her back rigid with anger. "Evening, Carol," I called pleasantly as we passed. She didn't respond, didn't turn around. Once we were out of earshot, Emma squeezed my hand. "That fence looks pretty good from this angle." "It does," I agreed. "And what's on the other side is now officially my decision." Max trotted ahead, unaware of the neighborhood power dynamics that had just dramatically shifted. To him, it was just another evening walk, another chance to sniff interesting things and feel the breeze in his fur. We rounded the corner, leaving Carol and her newly defined property behind. I didn't yet know what I would do with my quarter-acre parcel, perhaps a community garden space, maybe a small reading area with benches accessible to all the neighbors. What mattered was that the land would no longer be Carol's private extension, exempt from the rules she so rigidly enforced on others. The next HOA meeting was only a week away. I had my documentation ready, my presentation prepared. The fence was just the beginning of bringing accountability to Oakwood Estates, and I was ready for whatever came next. As we walked home in the fading light, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time since moving to Oakwood Estates, I felt like I truly belonged here. Not because I followed every arbitrary rule, but because I had found the courage to challenge unfairness when I saw it. The week between installing the fence and the quarterly HOA meeting passed in a flurry of preparation. I spent evenings hunched over my desk, organizing documents and refining my presentation, while Emma reviewed each slide with an attorney's critical eye. "You have all the evidence," she said the night before the meeting. "But how will you handle it if Carol tries to shut you down?" "I've reviewed the bylaws thoroughly," I replied, tapping a dog-eared copy on my desk. Section 7.3 explicitly states that any homeowner in good standing can bring matters of community concern to the floor during new business, with a minimum allocation of 5 minutes that can be extended by majority vote. Emma smiled. "You've done your homework." I had an excellent motivation. I closed my laptop and stretched. The fence was just step one. Tomorrow we restore balance to the whole neighborhood. On Thursday evening, I arrived at the community center 30 minutes before the scheduled 7 p.m. meeting. The room was empty except for Dolores, the elderly secretary who'd faithfully taken minutes at every HOA meeting for the past 15 years. "Evening, Griffin," she called, setting up her notepad. "You're here early. I have a presentation tonight." I placed my portfolio on the table and began arranging copies of the HOA bylaws at each seat. I'd highlighted relevant sections in yellow, with small tabs marking the most critical passages. Next to each bylaw booklet, I placed a stapled packet containing photographs and a timeline of selective enforcement incidents. "Must be important," Dolores observed, watching me set up a small projector connected to my laptop. "It concerns everyone in Oakwood Estates," I answered, testing the projection against the wall. "Fair application of our community standards." By 6:50, residents began filing in. The quarterly meetings typically drew 15 to 20 homeowners out of the neighborhood's 78 properties. Tonight, however, word had spread. Emma had tactfully mentioned to a few neighbors that they might find the meeting particularly enlightening, and those neighbors had told others. By 6:55, nearly 40 people filled the seats. I spotted Thaddeus near the front, leaning on his carved wooden cane. Imogene sat beside him, her cat-eye glasses catching the light when she nodded in my direction. Even Tom Wilson had come, moving carefully to a back row seat, still recovering from his back surgery. Carol entered at precisely 6:58, her silver bob immaculate as always. She paused momentarily at the unusual attendance, her eyes narrowing when she noticed me at the projector. Without acknowledging me, she moved to the front table and arranged her materials with practiced precision. "Quite a turnout," Emma whispered, sliding into the seat beside me. "There's power in numbers," I replied. At 7 sharp, Carol called the meeting to order with 3 taps of her gavel. "Welcome to the quarterly meeting of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association," she began, her voice carrying the same authoritative tone she'd used for 12 years. "We'll begin with roll call, followed by approval of last quarter's minutes, then the treasurer's report." I waited patiently through these formalities. The treasurer, Martha Bryan, Carol's longtime ally from Magnolia Court, reported a healthy balance in the community fund, with recent expenditures for new landscaping at the neighborhood entrance. "Moving on to old business," Carol continued. "The spring cleanup day is scheduled for next month. Sign-ups are available after the meeting. The Playground Equipment Committee has recommended replacements for the swings and slide, with installation planned for May." Carol worked through each agenda item efficiently, her manner suggesting nothing had changed since our confrontation. But I noticed how her eyes avoided the right side of the room where my fence now stood, visible through the windows. "Are there any new business items?" she finally asked, glancing around the room without looking in my direction. I raised my hand. "Yes, I have a matter to bring before the community." Carol's smile tightened. "The floor recognizes Griffin Peterson." I moved to the front of the room, connecting my laptop to the projector. The screen illuminated with a simple title, Oakwood Estates, a study in selective enforcement. "Thank you, Madam President," I began, my voice steady. "I've been a resident of Oakwood Estates for 3 years. During that time, I've observed concerning patterns in how our community standards are enforced. Tonight, I'd like to present documentation of these patterns and propose solutions to ensure fairness moving forward." Carol interrupted immediately. "We have several other items on the agenda, Mr. Peterson. Perhaps you could summarize your concerns in 2 minutes or less." I smiled politely. "According to Section 7.3 of our bylaws, which everyone has a copy of this evening, any homeowner in good standing is allocated a minimum of 5 minutes to present new business, with an extension available by majority vote if needed." I turned to the room. "My presentation will require approximately 15 minutes, after which I'll welcome discussion." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the audience. "Let him speak," called Thaddeus from the front row. Several others nodded. Carol pressed her lips together, then nodded curtly. "Proceed." I advanced to my first slide, a map of Oakwood Estates with property lines clearly marked. "First, I'd like to address a matter of property boundaries. Recently, I purchased a quarter-acre parcel adjacent to our HOA governed territory." I indicated the highlighted section. "This land was never incorporated into Oakwood Estates when the original developer went bankrupt in 2008. It has been under county ownership until 6 weeks ago when I acquired it through proper legal channels." I advanced to the next slide showing Carol's backyard extending onto the now fenced property. "For years, this land has been inappropriately used as an extension of another resident's yard, specifically the property at 347 Magnolia Court." I didn't need to specify that this was Carol's address. Everyone knew. During this time, the same resident has been rigorously enforcing property boundaries for others. I showed side-by-side photos of Imogene's garden with its citation for extending 6 inches beyond an approved line, contrasted with Carol's garden that had stretched 15 feet onto county land. Carol stood. "This is becoming unnecessarily personal." "I'm presenting documented facts," I countered calmly. "Not personal attacks." From the audience, Imogene called out, "I'd like to hear this, Carol." Carol slowly sat down, her hands clasped tightly before her. I continued methodically through my evidence, showing dozens of examples of selective enforcement, citations issued to homes on Cedar Lane and Willow Street for infractions identical to uncited violations on Magnolia Court, approval of architectural modifications for Carol's friends, while similar requests from other streets were denied. The pattern becomes clearer when we examine who serves on the Architectural Review Committee. I displayed meeting minutes from 7 years prior. This committee originally had 3 members, but was reduced to 1, the HOA president, due to what was described as a temporary lack of volunteers. That temporary situation has now lasted 7 years, creating a system where a single individual approves or denies all exterior modifications. I advanced to my next exhibit, a spreadsheet detailing HOA funding allocations. Additionally, financial records show disproportionate spending. Over the past 5 years, 68% of discretionary beautification funds were allocated to projects on Magnolia Court, which represents only 12% of our neighborhood's properties. Throughout the room, residents leaned forward in their seats. Some took notes, others whispered to neighbors. Carol remained rigidly in her chair, her expression unreadable. "Let me be clear," I continued. "I believe in standards and consistency. What I'm advocating for tonight is fair application of our rules across all streets in Oakwood Estates." Carol stood again. "Mr. Peterson, you've exceeded your time allocation." Before I could respond, Thaddeus raised his hand. "I move to extend the time for this presentation." "I second that motion," called Tom Wilson from the back. "All in favor?" Thaddeus prompted. Nearly every hand in the room went up. "Motion carries," Thaddeus announced, staring directly at Carol. She sank back into her chair. I proceeded with my remaining slides, concluding with a summary of Regulation 314, the rule about ornamental items that had started my investigation. My small planter was cited as a violation, while numerous decorative elements exist throughout the neighborhood, particularly concentrated on certain streets. I showed photographs of garden gnomes, bird baths, and decorative flags, all technically violations, all selectively permitted. In closing, I proposed 3 actions for immediate vote. I displayed my final slide. 1. Restructure the Architectural Review Committee to include 3 members from different streets. 2. Create transparent, consistently applied standards for all properties. 3. Hold a vote of confidence for current HOA leadership. Carol stood before I finished reading the points. "This is outrageous. I have served this community for 12 years. Under my leadership, property values have increased 37%. "No one questions your dedication, Carol," I replied. "But leadership requires fairness and transparency." Martha Bryan, the treasurer, spoke up. "These accusations are uncalled for. Carol has given countless hours to this community." Imogene rose slowly from her seat, her small frame straight despite her age. "I've lived in Oakwood Estates since it was built. I've received 5 citations in the past year for my garden, a garden that's been exactly the same for 20 years. Something has changed, and it's not my flowers." Other residents began sharing similar experiences: arbitrary denials of reasonable requests, inconsistent enforcement, preferential treatment. Years of frustration poured out in measured, respectful comments that carried more weight than any heated argument could have. When the testimonials concluded, I returned to my proposed actions. I move that we vote on each of these items separately, beginning with the restructuring of the Architectural Review Committee. "I second," called several voices simultaneously. Carol, recognizing she'd lost control of the meeting, attempted to regain some authority. "Very well, we'll conduct the vote according to procedure. On the matter of expanding the Architectural Review Committee to 3 members, those in favor?" Hands rose throughout the room, a clear majority. Those opposed? Only Carol and Martha kept their hands down. "Motion carries," Carol said stiffly. "The committee will be expanded. We'll need nominations." Thaddeus immediately spoke up. "I nominate Griffin Peterson, whose attention to detail and fairness would serve us well." "I nominate Imogene Finch," added another resident. "Her knowledge of plants and gardens would be valuable." A third nomination came for Robert Chen, an architect who lived on Cedar Lane. With no other nominations offered, all 3 candidates were unanimously approved. We moved to the second item, creating transparent, consistently applied standards. This too passed with overwhelming support. A working group was formed to review existing regulations and propose improvements at the next meeting. Finally, we reached the vote of confidence. The room grew quiet as Carol faced the community she'd ruled for over a decade. "On the matter of confidence in current HOA leadership," I said, I move that we vote by secret ballot to respect everyone's privacy. Paper slips were distributed. The vote was tallied by Dolores, who had no stake in the outcome. The result, 37-2 in favor of removing Carol as president. The community has spoken, I announced. According to our bylaws, the vice president will assume leadership until a special election can be held next month. Carol sat motionless as Vice President Alan Thompson moved to the center chair. The remainder of the meeting proceeded efficiently under his direction, concluding with one final piece of business: a blanket approval for reasonable decorative elements on all properties, effective immediately. As residents filed out, many stopped to thank me or share their relief at the changes. Thaddeus patted my shoulder as he passed. "About time someone stood up to her," he murmured. Emma and I were among the last to leave. Carol remained seated at the table, staring at her meticulous notes. The meeting room had emptied except for Martha, who waited awkwardly by the door. "You'll regret this," Carol said quietly as we passed. "Maintaining standards requires a firm hand." I paused. "No, Carol. Maintaining a community requires fairness and respect. Everyone deserves the same consideration, whether they live on Magnolia Court or Cedar Lane." Outside in the parking lot, Emma slipped her arm through mine. "That went even better than we expected." "People were ready for change," I replied. "They just needed someone to take the first step." We walked home through the warm evening, passing houses whose owners now had the freedom to place a planter or bird feeder without fear of arbitrary citations. The neighborhood itself seemed to exhale with relief. The next morning, I placed my ceramic blue-gray planter back in its spot near our walkway, arranging the purple and white flowers that had started this whole journey. Max sat beside me, watching with interest as I patted the soil around each bloom. "What do you think, buddy?" I asked. "Better?" He wagged his tail, seemingly pleased with the addition to our front yard. From across the street, Imogene waved as she adjusted her own garden border, extending it to the spot she had always intended before Carol's restrictions. One by one, small changes appeared throughout Oakwood Estates. Not the chaos Carol had predicted, but thoughtful, personal touches that gave each home its unique character while maintaining the neighborhood's overall harmony. As the new member of the Architectural Review Committee, I knew there would be work ahead creating guidelines that protected property values without strangling personal expression. But looking at my modest planter, finally home where it belonged, I felt confident we were on the right path.